Live from London, this is The Late Show with Naureen Khalid on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
Hello, everyone. This is Naureen Khalid. It's 8 o'clock on Wednesday, the 6th of October, and I'm your host on Teachers Talk Radio, The Late Show on Wednesday. On tonight's show, I have the very wonderful Stephen Lane, also known as Sputnik Steve on Twitter, as my guest. We'll be talking about pastoral care, religion, teaching, and lots more. Stay with us for what promises to be a really interesting hour and a half. And I see Stephen has already joined us. Hi, Steve.
Hello, how are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you. How are you?
I'm very, very well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on tonight.
No, thank you for giving up your Wednesday evening for me. That's and my listeners. That's really kind of you. Thank you.
No, it is a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
It's really great to have you with us. And to anybody listening in, welcome to you all. We've got Steve in the studio already. If this is your show, so do join in and do call in or text or send us a message on social media. Ask Steve anything you want to know. And if this is your first time tuning in, or you would just like to find out a bit more about us, then please head over to our website, www.ttradio.org. If you have thought about hosting a radio show of your own, but didn't know where to start, then our website has the details about how to get in touch with us. And the team will be delighted to hear from you. And you may become one of our latest hosts with a show of your own. So, like I said, my guest tonight is Stephen Lane. Stephen, is it all right? How do you prefer to be called, Steve?
I mean,
Stephen?
anything so long as it's not swearing. I'll answer to anything.
Okay,
Stephen is fine. Steve is fine too.
Okay. I mentally, I've always called you Steve because your Twitter handle of Sputnik Steve, and for me, you're Steve rather than Stephen. But I wanted to ask you what you would mean.
It's an interesting thing, this thing about names. And perhaps it's a crisis of identity that I always have. That I seem to keep changing my preferences for what handle I go by, both on social media and in real life as well. I found myself very recently signing off my emails to colleagues as Stephen, whereas I'd gotten into a habit of just signing off as S. So who knows? Call me what you like, it's fine.
That reminds me, I've always wanted to know what's the story behind your Twitter handle.
So it has connotations, doesn't it? Of the word Sputnik is the name of the Russian satellite, and it was the first, as far as I'm aware, it was the first human-made artificial satellite to go into space, and it was a communications satellite. So sometimes I like to make up the story that I chose that name because of my interest in space and astronomy. Sometimes I like to say that I chose that name because it was to do with communication, which is what social media is all about. Sometimes I like to say that it's because of the American education program named after Sputnik. Following the launch of the satellite, the Americans felt that they needed to boost their education to catch up with the Russians. But the truth of the matter is that there was one day I went and had my hair cut, and I had it a bit sort of spiky, and I came in the front door, and my wife looked at me and went, "Oh, hello, Sputnik." And that's where it comes from. So when you're making that initial logging on bit to a social media platform, and you've got that decision about what you're going to call yourself, at the time that I joined Twitter, I had the intention of being anonymous because at the time I probably wanted to moan a little bit about the school that I was in.
Mhm.
That didn't last long, really, but
Mm.
so that's where that came from.
That didn't last long. The morning or the school or you in the school?
A mixture. The wanting to moan. When I was looking back on my very early tweets, which I was doing recently because that's what my doctoral thesis was all
Yeah.
about. Um, I discovered that actually very early on in my tweeting career, I was actually tweeting colleagues at the school that I worked at. So obviously the desire to remain anonymous didn't last that long. Um, and neither did actually the wanting to moan about schools. I joined Twitter in the same year that I started working at that particular school. I'm no longer
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
And actually, despite some, I do have criticisms about the way that school was ran. It was never something that I necessarily wanted to publicly articulate.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. I've always wondered about that. So thank you.
No problem.
Uh, so we have your wife to thank for that.
Yes, indeed. Well, I have my wife to thank for so very many things.
Yeah. You're right. When I joined Twitter first, I had a really complicated handle because I never thought I'll use it much. I joined Jo Pen, my friend. She said, "Oh, are you on Twitter?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I don't think I will be." Then we used to have somebody, Sheena Lewington. At that time, she was tweeting anonymously as Clerk to Governors,
Uh-huh.
and her blogs were really, really one of the best governing blogs I am around, and so I started following. I joined Twitter in order to is that background review on me? Yeah,
Sorry?
I just had some feedback coming in.
Ah, no.
So yeah, I joined Twitter in order to follow Sheena, and at that time I thought, well, I'll only follow Sheena and Joe, and that's it. So I had a really complicated handle with just lots of underscores and lots of things in it.
Mhm.
Um, and then when I did start getting followers, and if somebody said, "What's your handle?" and 9 times out of 10, I wouldn't remember my handle because it was so complicated. So I thought, no, I'll give it up and I'll stay I'll make another one. So that's how I came. But
Yeah.
I've still hung on to that because my at that time I used to have Storyfy and that was linked to that. So I thought
Yes.
I'll hang on to my Twitter account, but I don't use that one as much.
No,
Mm.
and I find the whole thing about online identities and names absolutely fascinating. And I've got a couple of Twitter accounts that I run. I've got the curriculum ed one as well, and I've got I tweet sometimes from my school account, and these kind of different presentations of oneself um, are fascinating. And when it came to publishing the book, I had a kind of debate with myself about what name I should put on the cover, because obviously in the real world, I'm known as Stephen or Steve, but
Yeah.
nobody really knows me by my, well, certainly didn't know me by my flesh name, as I call it,
Yeah.
on social media, and it was through Twitter mainly that the whole book thing came about in the first place.
Yeah.
And so what I ended up doing was actually putting both names on the cover of the book, so that there was that connection. And um, there was a moment some years ago where one person got into an argument with me and old Andrew, as it happens, and they published this really weird blog where they were kind of making fun of us for trying to be anonymous. Um, and they said, but here's Steve. He's anonymous, but he's even linked to a Just Giving page with his real name on it. Yes, I'm not trying to be anonymous. And there's this whole thing about being anonymous as opposed
Yeah.
to being pseudonymous.
Yeah.
And thinking about Vic Reeves, for example, is not that man's real name.
Yeah.
Um, and lots of people use pseudonyms because there's an element, I suppose, of presenting a character or caricature to the world. And you start to wonder, is that what I've been doing through social media? And I think we all do, to an extent, actually. The version that we present to the world on social media of ourselves is performative.
Mhm.
regardless actually of what name we're using. But I find the whole thing about names and identity kind of fascinating. I went through a phase, I still do it sometimes, of changing, aside from the Twitter handle, you've got your actual name on there.
Yeah.
I went through a phase of changing that every day, just to kind of, for my own, entertainment really. And it really threw people, it really flummoxed people. So that was interesting. But so yeah, names and identities I do find fascinating.
Oh, lovely. So we've got Roger here, Tom Rogers, who's joined us, as well
Hey,
as
Tom.
English with Tahina, who's joining us from France, Jenny, Maya. Good evening. Oh, Maya is from Egypt. Hello, everyone.
Oh
Thank you
wow.
for joining us. Yeah, so from Egypt, from France, and from everywhere. Um, uh, Again, going on the tangent, Twitter names and anonymous accounts. What do you think? Should people be allowed to have anonymous accounts?
Yeah, I think they should. There's perhaps an argument in favour of requiring a verifiable email address to register that
Mhm.
Twitter or whatever platform has access to. But I think in terms of actually being on the platform, I think it's fundamental really to be able to protect your identity, because we've seen people using people's real identities in malicious ways. And if you are going to say things about I mean, I've already mentioned Andrew, of course. Old Andrew initially was writing about things that needed to be said,
Yes.
but I can perfectly understand why he might choose to protect his real world identity by saying those things. Um, so I think absolutely people should be able to be anonymous on social media. As I say, whether or not there needs to be a strong verification process, there might be an argument in favour of that, because um, we've all seen how people can misuse the platform. We've all seen
Mhm.
people who use multiple accounts to target and harass others. I mean, Naureen, you've been on the receiving end of plenty of that.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so I think that perhaps there does need to be um, some way of monitoring who's using the platform,
Okay.
some way for Twitter to be able to monitor who's actually using it. But the anonymous nature of the public facing bit of the platform, I think, is important.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, unless I had met you, there's no way I would have known that the picture on your account and your name is who you say you are. So
Well,
the
that's
anonymous
absolutely
bit,
true.
yeah. So that's it. When I'm interacting with people, there's nothing unless I know them myself. There's nothing to tell me whether even if it's not a anonymous account, whether they are actually who they say they are. So I think
Yes.
this is yeah. And the other thing is, I've got 3 accounts now. I had, like I said, one was I originally made 2 accounts, one for governance and one for
Hmm.
family. But then my family started following me on my governance account, and
Yeah.
that got complicated. So I set up the third account with an easy to say, easy to remember name, but I held on to my other 2. Now,
Mm.
if somebody blocks me on my main account, I always go on to my other 2 accounts and I send them a tweet that, look, you blocked me on the main, that's fine, your choice. But this is also my account, just in case you don't know. And then you think, well, I've blocked her, but she's got 2 others. And
Yes.
I thought that was me being really upfront and transparent and everything. But I've got people who sort of, abuse is too strong, but he sort of said, why are you doing that? What does this mean? Why are you tweeting this?
Yes.
So, I can't
I mean,
understand people.
well, you can't win, can you? There's no way that you can
Yeah,
win. There's always going to be somebody that is going to find or take offence in whatever you say, whatever you
okay.
do.
Yeah.
There's always going to be somebody who's going to have, and especially, I think it's fair to say that you and I have both probably kind of established a bit of a reputation amongst some people, and once that's lodged in their minds, they're never going to see
Yeah.
any other aspect of who you are and what you're doing.
Mm.
You're an evil neo trad, and that's that.
Well, yeah, I am a tribe, but really, everybody listening, I'm not evil at all. I'm really quite sweet.
That's right. Yes, yes. But you see some of the argy-bargy that goes on, and
Yeah,
I've decided to try and steer clear of all that kind of stuff. I used to
yeah,
quite enjoy getting involved in
yeah.
that kind of stuff, but it's not good for the spirit.
Yeah, it's I mean, cut I haven't completely stopped. I don't think I ever will. That's my nature. If I see somebody having a go at you and I've seen
Mm,
that and I know that that's wrong, I will, jump in and say that, no, Steve, it's not what he's not evil,
yes,
and all of that. But it does, yeah. Anyway,
yes.
but that's
Sometimes because there's a sense sometimes that you feel that someone's been wronged, and there's a you want to address that wrong. You want to uh, redress the balance, and certainly and actually this is a really good opportunity for me to say this publicly, which is you have supported me on so many occasions, online, on Twitter in particular, um,
well,
from
vice versa. The one which I'll never not do is defend somebody who's been wrongly accused of racism or sexism. I mean, these two
mm,
are such horrible things in real
mm,
life, and to be falsely accused is awful. Um, so if I know somebody, I mean, I
mm.
they are that way, and if somebody accuses them, I will jump in and say, and that gets me into trouble. But hey,
That's right, and I mean the one that's a particular favourite is the accusation of bullying, isn't it?
yeah,
Um, and these are kind of easy accusations to make, but they're potentially so damaging.
yeah,
And the ones that always kind of half entertain me and half kind of shock me, I suppose, are those ones where they'll tag your employer in, or they'll tag the LEA or the trust that you work for into responses, and accuse you of breaking the Nolan principles and these sorts of things.
yeah,
Um, and you just think, where's the rational discourse here? And um, it dissipates very, very quickly in
mm,
some conversations with some people. The idea of rational discourse just disappears rapidly, and they jump to the kind of easy accusations,
yeah,
lazy accusations, which then, when there are genuine incidents of racism and sexism and bullying, there's the potential. I think there's a danger, isn't there, that those things somehow get trivialized
exactly,
through the misapplication of those
exactly.
terms, and
Exactly.
perhaps.
If everybody is a racist, then nobody is.
Mhm,
Yeah, and that's that is the main reason I do. I mean, there are two reasons. One, I don't like people being falsely accused of such horrendous things, and secondly, because these are horrendous things, I want them to be used properly, and for people who are racist to
mhm.
be held account, and not just because you didn't like what somebody said about tables in rows, for example.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff.
Right. So, yeah, that went off on a tangent, didn't it?
I did.
Uh, why is it? Yeah, good. No, that was a good discussion. Your PhD thesis, how much of Twitter went into that?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Your PhD thesis, was
Oh,
that?
okay, right,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so the title of my thesis is something along the lines of Twitteratopia: the
Mm,
rise of EduTwitter, the Tweeter Society, and a teacher who tweets. So, you'll
mm,
remember that there was a couple of years where I was tweeting a bit about Michel Foucault,
yeah.
and I used, so the first half of the thesis is a kind of theoretical framing of how Twitter, well, EduTwitter in particular, operates as a discursive space. What
Mhm,
I observed, particularly sort of around 2013 on Twitter, was something quite important happening, where um, teachers on social media, teachers on Twitter, teachers who are writing blogs, were being listened to, were being noticed by people at the DfE
Mm,
and by the inspectorate at Ofsted. And there was a kind of key shift, I think, in 2013, when in particular Michael Gove mentions people like old Andrew and Tom Bennett in a speech that he gave. And around about the same time, Ofsted were putting out their new handbook, which had clearly been put out in response to discussions that have been happening in blogs and social media about the damage that their previous approach perhaps was doing. And it just struck me that there was something important happening here where the voice of actual classroom practitioners, of actual teachers, could be heard without having the proxy of unions or without having to go through the proxy of senior leaders. That there was a direct voice from the teachers which was being heard. And so I talked about how in the first part of the thesis, I kind of talked about that and how that operates, and I call that the Tweetcher Society. So people who engage in discussions on Twitter, and also the other thing that then happened, and I think it was 2013 again, or certainly thereabouts, was when Research Ed was launched, which again was this kind of groundswell of normal teachers with an interest in developing their practice along the lines of becoming research and evidence informed. And the spark of that event took place on Twitter.
mm,
Um, and then there was the first conference, and the tickets I think sold out within a matter of hours for that. And in the year since, of course, it's become a huge phenomenon around the world, in fact, with so many teachers and academics working together, sharing ideas, sharing discussions about classroom practice. It's a phenomenal movement. And so the first half of my thesis is about all of that, and I use some kind of theoretical tools from Foucault to kind of establish that as a discursive thing. And then the second half of the thesis is essentially an autoethnographic account of when I started using Twitter.
mhm.
So I looked back at the first bunch of tweets that I sent out in 2011 and then 2012, and I kind of reflected on, do those tweets still represent and reflect what I think now, 10 years later? How are those tweets operating? We were talking earlier about identity, and part of it is about identity creation and identity performance. So I was kind of looking at those early tweets to try and understand what maybe I was doing as Sputnik Steve, um, as a creation of self, and that's what it comes down to really. And I suppose my overall claim with it is that by engaging with discussions on Twitter, you are actually reforming your self identity, which, if you channel that effectively and correctly, is actually a really potent form of professional development, essentially. So that's what the thesis is about.
Are you in a position to publish any papers from it?
So the thesis has I passed my Viva back in February. I had to do quite a few corrections to it, so I got those done, and I had my letter just a couple of weeks ago to say that I've completed successfully, and so I
Yay.
have passed my doctorate now. So my supervisor said I can use the title, so that's all I need to know. So yeah, I think there's potentially a few papers that could come out of it. But I'm not even going to begin looking at that just yet. I need a bit of time away from it. I think because I started it's an EdD that I did actually rather than a
Yeah,
PhD, and I started
yeah.
it 10 years ago. And I just need to take a step back from it a little bit, I think. But I think I will revisit some of the stuff in there and try and get some bits published here and there.
Oh, that'll be interesting. I'm sure it's going to make fascinating reading for those of us, especially those of us who are on Twitter and those of us who have been following Edu Twitter for some time. That it would be interesting to see what you know what you found, what your research came up.
And it's interesting, when I started looking at it, there wasn't really a huge amount out there about specifically. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount about Twitter, frankly. There certainly wasn't much about sort of teachers' Twitter, Edu Twitter. But by the time that I'd finished the darn thing, there was a lot more that was coming out. And one of the most recent ones, of course, was the Steve Watson thing that came out in digital form a couple of years ago, and then I think there was the hard copy version in the Bira Journal this year, which was the New Right 2.0 micro populism thing, which is a really fascinating paper. I mean, some of it's challengeable, and there's plenty of people who challenged it on Twitter. But it's an interesting perspective on how Edu Twitter, how teachers have kind of become politicized, perhaps through, or maybe they've always been politicized, I don't know, but how Twitter has enabled that. I was fascinated by the idea of it being populist, this discourse that was coming out of some of the participants that Watson identified. Found that quite an interesting accusation, really. So that's an interesting paper. But there's been some interesting stuff that's come out in recent years, but not much really about the kind of stuff that I was talking about. Certainly, I haven't found anything else that uses food code to talk about Edu Twitter, but maybe there's stuff out there.
So that I always wonder whether when Edu Twitter gets really fractious, when there are lots of blocking going on and muting and people getting really upset and some throwing their toys out of the pram, etc. And I wonder whether it was always like that, and I just didn't notice it because I only had about 20 followers, and I'm noticing it more now because I'm spending more time on it. Or has it actually become more confrontational, maybe?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I mean, I don't know. I think when I joined Twitter, it was back in 2011 when I joined, and fairly early on, I was observing and certainly involved in quite sort of fractious discussions. I think probably as more people have joined the community, if you like, that's perhaps become more so. I don't know if it's particularly new or if once you've been on it for a while, you see the same arguments getting recycled. You see new people joining and then kind of having arguments that you were having previously a couple of years ago. And so you just kind of, from my point of view, it's kind of like, get a bit tired of that sort of stuff. But it's so easy to get distracted by all of that and forget that what the teacher community on Twitter are really good at is being very supportive of each other and sharing fantastic resources. There's people who are willingly sharing resources and ideas for free. You have people who people who are academics, people like Willingham and others like that, who are engaging with the teacher community to move us forward in our practice in all sorts of different ways, and even people that I disagree with. I've learned a lot from people that I disagree with. And so long as the discourse is civil, you can have some fantastic conversations with people on Twitter.
I was going to say that many of my most fascinating discussions have been with people I disagree with, and but because they are civil and we bounce ideas off, so that helps me. Either I change my mind or I don't. But the fact that I have listened to the other side and then still not change my mind, I think that's another positive, that I haven't just it's not an entrenched position. It's because I have listened to that person. And then they haven't managed to change my mind.
That's right. I used to, a lot of the people that I was most challenging towards were people that I initially agreed with. And
mm,
part of the reason why I would challenge those is because I'm kind of testing out my own ideological positions and often finding them wanting. And where I've changed my mind about things is usually because I've challenged somebody that I agree with, and their response has been unconvincing, and you actually think, well, maybe I was wrong about that then. And you know,
mm,
you come across people who are very convincing in their arguments, and you think, oh, okay, yeah, that maybe there's merit in that. Maybe I need to think about that again. And there's been lots of times where I've said something, often quite flippantly, and then somebody's come back at me to say, actually, I'm not sure that that's right. I'm not sure that's appropriate. And I've ended up saying, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I've apologized on Twitter before now
mm,
because,
mm,
somebody, I've said something flippant perhaps, or just blatantly wrong. And somebody has taken the time to point it out to me in a supportive and friendly way. And you kind of go, yeah, okay, that's a fair comment. Um, so yeah, I think it's very easy to allow yourself to get swayed by the sort of negative stuff that's on
yeah,
there,
yeah.
and to completely forget about all the great stuff that's going on. And there is a lot of great stuff going on Twitter.
I remember when E.D. Hirsch was here and he spoke at Policy Exchange. So I went
Uh-huh.
along to that event and I tweeted something along the lines that, listening to E.D. Hirsch, the legend, or the hero or something. And somebody, I usually have, I forget forget the handle. Anyway, he asked me, why do I think he is a legend? And that made me sort of sit back and think, how do I explain it to somebody who probably doesn't think that E.D. Hirsch is a legend?
Yes.
And I said, well, because of cultural knowledge. And I then gave my example that I come from an educated, family in Pakistan, and my father and mother were both, they both went to university. They both had masters and higher degrees, and
Hmm.
they used to talk to me about the partition, about Indian history. My father knew Persian, so he would, recite Persian poetry to us.
Ah.
And he'd take us out to these archaeological ruins and tell us all about it. But
Mm.
that sort of formed who I am. But that is only because I was lucky enough to be born in that family. And
Hmm.
what E.D. Hirsch argues is that cultural knowledge, everybody should have access to that. So as far as I read him, he says, there should be cultural knowledge about it, and he hasn't. Although he's given a list of things which people should know or children should know, but that's American. There's nothing stopping you to making a list yourself in Pakistan, for example, and saying every child should know about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and Chokandi tombs, which I know because my parents told me about it. So
Yes.
but I only sort of verbalized it because I was challenged on saying, but because the challenge was polite, it wasn't a
That's right.
confrontational.
And being forced to give an account of yourself like
Yes,
that
yes,
is a really interesting and productive activity, I think.
yeah,
To
yeah,
actually, stop and think, well, why do I believe what I believe?
Dave, yeah,
Why am I doing? And as teachers, I think that we aren't encouraged enough to do that on a regular basis. I
mm,
think as teachers, as classroom teachers, as middle leaders, and as senior leaders, I think we are far too busy um, to be able to actually sit and reflect upon. And there's an irony, when you're training to teach. I can remember doing my BA. You would have to write evaluations of the lessons that you've taught, and as soon as you qualify, that's it. You don't have to do that anymore.
yeah,
And it's odd, really, that um, we aren't used in teaching as standard practice to reflect on our practice. We're not used to actually giving an account of why we're teaching what we're teaching, and why we're teaching it in the way that we're teaching, and why we're doing the things that we are doing. We are not expected to reflect on that, and yet in other professions they are, and certainly in teachers in other countries are also expected to give an account of that and to engage in a much more sort of reflective practice. And I wish that we could do that more here.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Right. Going back to your day job now.
Okay.
Um, so you're um, I believe you teach English as well as computing.
Okay, so I'm a teacher of English. I'm not teaching computing. I only ever taught computing when there was a gap in the timetable and I needed somebody to do it.
Ah,
I'm not a computing specialist. I'm just somebody who's interested in computing. So I taught a bit of Year 7 computing from time to time, but I'm a teacher of English.
okay. Well, that's because I was going to say, is that an odd combination? But you've explained that there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of an odd combination, isn't it?
Yeah. Um, are you still head of year?
Yes, I've had a slight change of roles this year. So I work in an independent school,
Uh-huh.
and I've been there now for 6 years. And I took on the role of head of year for year 7, 8, and 9, which always sounds massive, but of course at our place. Um, that was probably about 120, 130 students that I was overseeing. But this year I've taken on the role of leading our chaplaincy.
Ah,
Our school chaplain left at Easter, and I've taken over running the chaplaincy bit. So I relinquished the head of year 8 and 9. I'm still head of year 7 though at my place. So I'm head of year 7 and chaplaincy lead.
oh, that brings me to something I was going to ask later on, but we might as well do that now. Um, how important is religion in your life, and why? How did you, how did you get into it? How did you
Hmm.
decide that yes, chaplaincy is for me?
Yes, it's an interesting question, and I mean, this could take up the rest of the the rest of the time on the show. But my personal journey on that has, I grew up in an atheist household,
Mm,
um, and I wasn't christened as a child, and but the school that I was at school in the 70s and the 80s. Every school had to be religious back then. We had to, have religious themed assemblies and sing hymns and things. And I always had in the back of my head a kind of question about um, the nature of the divine and about God and those sorts of things. So it was always kind of there. Through my teenage years, I became a sort of arrogant atheist myself, thinking that religious people must be stupid and weak,
mm,
but never being convinced by that. And I started to get interested I was reading about, you know, paganism and Wicca and those sorts of things. But I discovered Taoism, and I still consider myself to have some Taoist leanings. I think the Tao Te Ching is such a beautiful and powerful collection of words. Um, but alongside all of that happening, I met my wife, who grew up with attending church on a weekly basis. We got married in a church, so I made my vows to my wife before God, and it was when our first daughter was born, and I held her in my arms the first time. She was born prem. She
mhm,
was born like 32 weeks, and
mm,
it was the definition of a miracle as far as I was concerned.
mhm,
It was seeing her when she opened her eyes and I saw her eyes for the first time. I felt an overwhelming sense of the divine right there.
mhm.
And then when we had a conversation with our local vicar about having our daughter christened, about having her baptized, and the vicar came round to the house and talked us through what that entailed and what would happen. I just got this overwhelming sense at that point that I needed that as well. So I was baptized the same year as my daughter, which would be
Oh,
about 11
yeah.
years ago now. And then I was confirmed later that year here at Lichfield in the cathedral. And from that point on, I started to get involved in my local church, started to help out leading some of the family services, leading Christmas services and those sorts of things. They do a wonderful thing in our village here, which is a barn nativity, which is kind of what it says on the tin. It's a celebration of the nativity, actually in a barn. So a local
Yeah.
farmer offers their space up, and so you're actually doing this nativity surrounded by animals and hay. It's phenomenal. And then so there was that pull through, you know, that I had. There was this voice in the back of my head that was getting louder about a desire to follow that kind of path.
Mhm.
That then coincided with me moving out of the state sector. I've been a teacher in the state sector for about 15 years, and I moved into the independent school that I'm at now, which is a Christian cathedral school. And fairly early on was having conversations with the chaplain about questions about theology, questions about faith, questions about the sermons that he was giving. He moved on, and we got a new school chaplain in a few years ago, who again I was having many conversations with about my own sort of sense of calling, and questions about theology again, and those sorts of issues. And so when he left, he had a word with the head teacher and said, "I think Steve would be good at doing this sort of work." And so that was a conversation that the head and I then had. So it's been a pull, and it's almost like kind of falling slowly. It's like you
Mm.
don't plan to, you know, gravity's there. You know, you don't
Yeah.
plan to stick to the earth,
Yeah.
but you've got no choice in it.
Yeah.
And it feels a little bit like, you know, I was moving in that direction. That was the flow that my life was leading in.
Yeah.
And so and I'm really enjoying the chaplaincy bit, actually. And as head of year, so we're with a cathedral school, but we've also got our own little chapel attached to our school, which is where we have year group assemblies. And so as head of year, I was leading these year group assemblies, and really feeling that was something that I wanted to do more of, that I wanted to build on that aspect of my work. It felt important. It felt important to me to be doing that.
That's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
You're very welcome.
Okay. We're going to stop for a little advert break and go on to the news desk. While we do that, when we come back, I'm going to ask you whether religion has played a role in making you look at pastoral care or not. So have a think about that while
Okay.
we play the adverts and the news.
Okay. Speak to you soon.
Support for phonics teaching. Did you know Oxford University Press now has 3 DFE validated programs to help you? Read, Write, Ink Phonics, Floppy's Phonics, the brand new Essential Letters and Sounds. Essential Letters and Sounds will get all your children reading well, quickly, using phonics books you may already have in your classroom. Developed by the Knowledge Schools Trust English Hub, it's affordable, easy to use, and makes teaching phonics with letters and sounds more effective. Whatever your school's phonics needs, Oxford has the solution. To find out more and receive support from your expert local educational consultant, visit oxfordprimary.com/phonics.
Hello everyone and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond. I'm your host, Deanna Lincook, making space for honest conversations about Black, British, Caribbean and African history. Here to teach you all the things left out of your school books. Make sure you subscribe to the History Hotline on all good podcast platforms. Follow us on social media at the History Hotline on Instagram and at the History HL on Twitter to find out about new upcoming episodes.
Do you struggle with people pleasing? Is it a constant battle managing different and difficult personalities? Why not inspire, challenge, and empower your team through the MAL CPD Essential Coaching Skills?
Oh.
Need support with your phonics teaching? Did you know Oxford University Press now has 3 DFE validated programs to help you? Read, Write, Ink Phonics, Floppy's Phonics, and the brand new Essential Letters and Sounds. Essential Letters and Sounds will get all your children reading well quickly using phonics books you may already have in your classroom. Developed by the Knowledge Schools Trust English Hub, it's affordable, easy to use, and makes teaching phonics with letters and sounds more effective. Whatever your school's phonics needs, Oxford has the solution. To find out more and receive support from your expert local educational consultant, visit oxfordprimary.com/phonics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. The government has laid out plans to make offering, advertising, or providing essay writing services to university and college students for financial gain illegal. The new measure will be part of the Skills and Post-16 Education Bill, which hopes to transform further and technical education. The Department for Education said it hopes the criminalisation of essay mill services will stop students from falling prey to deceptive marketing techniques from contract cheating services. The latest coronavirus figures show that 204,000 students were absent in England last week due to contracting or having close contact with the virus. This equates to 1 in 40 students off school in England, up from 1 in 80 on September the 7th. Teaching unions have called the statistics grim and fear it is the unvaccinated status of the majority of 10 to 19-year-olds that is causing the rise. That was your latest Teachers Talk Radio News.
Welcome back. It's Wednesday. We're coming up to 9 o'clock. It's about 10 minutes to 9. I'm Naureen Khalid, and this is Teachers Talk Radio, the Wednesday Late Show. And with me, we have Dr. Stephen Lane.
Yes. Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I should have said that before, but I didn't know that you had, that I was able to say that now.
Wow.
Yeah. Am I the person who's called you doctor on the public forum?
On a public forum, I think you might be.
Oh, wonderful. Right. So, religion and pastoral care. Now, I get the feeling religion is important to you, and you've already explained how you got to where you are. Has that informed your work which you have done as far as pastoral care is concerned?
It has. So, I mean, the context that I am working in, which is a school which celebrates a Christian ethos, although we welcome students of all faiths and none, it's pretty easy for me to draw upon the teachings of the Christian tradition within my sort of pastoral work, particularly when it comes to the messages that I want to deliver through our assemblies. And one of the things that I've talked about in the book and talked about elsewhere is the importance of a pastoral curriculum. Thinking about what we were talking earlier about, what is it that we want our kids to know, but also from a pastoral point of view, a pastoral curriculum. What is it? What are the ways in which we want our kids to behave? What kinds of people do we actually want them to be? How do we want them to view themselves in the world in which they find themselves? And so a lot of those questions are answered for me in that faith tradition. And it comes down to the main message that I always try to give the students is found in the commandments that Jesus gives us, which number one is love God, but number two is love thy neighbor as thyself. And that's a formulation of the golden rule that we find in, I think, if I'm not wrong, in every religion that we find in the world has a version of that kind of that rule. It's the golden rule. It's treat others as you would wish to be treated. And I think that that's such a fundamental message, and we get it wrong all the time because we're human and we make mistakes. But if we acknowledge that we make mistakes, and we apologize for the mistakes that we make, and we move on with the intention of loving our neighbor, with the intention of treating others as we would wish to be treated. That's not to say that we give other people a free pass all the time, but it is to couch everything that we do in a spirit of love, in a spirit of being supportive, rather than in a spirit of aggression or a spirit of attempting to diminish other people. Elsewhere in the letters of St. Paul, I think, there's the suggestion that we should use our words carefully, that we should use our words to raise others up rather than to push them down. And that has been something that, again, I call upon in my pastoral work. And a lot of the time, the pastoral stuff that I'm dealing with between students is relational conflicts. Friends fall out, they have their shifting dynamics of friendship groups and those sorts of things. And kids say horrible stuff to each other. Kids put ridiculous things about each other online. They're constantly, talking about each other in WhatsApp groups, even though I keep telling them that they're not old enough to have WhatsApp. And so a lot of that kind of work, when you're trying to resolve issues between individuals, is to say, okay, the things that you have said, are they coming from a spirit of wanting to support the other person, or are they coming from a position of wanting to harm or upset that other person? Which, plenty of people out there will have those kind of conversations with kids without having a religious conviction. But for me, what I think the religious tradition does is it gives me a language in which to think about these things. And a language in which to address these things. So it might not be overtly religious. I don't go up to kids and say, remember, folks, Jesus teaches us to do this, that, and the other. That's not what it's about. But it is about saying, okay, what's happened here, the things that we have said, the things that we have done, perhaps have been intended to harm others. How would it be if our intention tomorrow was to support each other? Now, I'm not saying that you have to like each other, because you're human, and I don't expect everybody to be best friends. But even people we don't like, we can still treat with some kindness. We can still treat with some respect. So that, I think, as a primary driver for the way that I operate within the pastoral role is from that perspective. I also think, one of the things that I'm increasingly interested in, and I've been tweeting a little bit about this lately, is about the pastoral care that school leaders offer to their staff.
Yes.
And it's very easy, I think, to kind of forget that layer. We talk about well-being a lot nowadays, don't we? Well-being, which amounts to the same thing, really. And one of the things that, as the chaplaincy role, is that I'm there for pastoral support for the kids, but I'm also there for pastoral support for the parents and for my colleagues too. And again, the sort of religious tradition there has helped me to kind of grapple with that aspect of the work, certainly. So I think really what it does is it gives me a framework that helps me to do my pastoral work.
That's really interesting what you say. what you said about loving your neighbor, that reminded me of something Muslims have in the Quran. I can't remember. I don't remember the exact translation, but it goes
Mhm.
something like you can't be a good Muslim if your neighbor is not protected from harm coming
Uh-huh.
from you. And
Yeah.
it doesn't say that you can't be a good Muslim if your Muslim neighbor isn't protected. It just says you can't be a good Muslim if your neighbor is harmed by you. So I
Mm.
think it's something, it's the same thing about loving your neighbor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
And
interesting.
it is that ultimate essence of that is where the great potential of humanity lies, isn't it? In the way that we treat others, and it's also where the great tragedy of humanity lies, which is where we fail to do that. um and whether we're talking about a quarrel between kids in school, or whether we're talking about warring nations, essentially it's the same problem, which is a refusal or an inability or a lack of willingness to just take a step back and think about the other person as a person.
Yeah.
um Throughout history, what do we do to our enemies? We first have to dehumanize them in order
Mm,
for them to
yeah,
be enemies.
yeah.
And so this is an antidote to that dehumanizing of
Okay.
the other, where we have to acknowledge and recognize and celebrate the inherent humanity of our fellow people.
Interesting. You talk a lot about knowledge-rich pastoral
Yeah.
curriculum. Whatever is that?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a good question, isn't it? And it comes back to what I said a little earlier about what are the key things that we want kids to know. That's the key question of any kind of curriculum. What are the things that we want our children to know? A knowledge-rich pastoral curriculum asks the same question, but it's what are the key things that we want our children to know about themselves? What are the
Mhm.
key things that we want our children to know about each other? What are the key things that we want children to know about their place in the world, um, and how they can come to terms with their place in the world? Um, what are the key questions that what are the key things that we want our children to know about the communities that they inhabit? And I use the word communities as a plural quite deliberately there, because it's very easy to think of ourselves as being a member of one community, but each individual is a member of several communities. They're a member of their family community, they're a member of their extended family community, there might be a member of a religious community, there might be a member of any other kind of social groups that they're part of, as well as being a member of the school community. And then within the school community, of course, they're members of a year group community, they're members of a form group community. But there's also all of the hidden curriculum stuff. What is it that kids are learning that we aren't deliberately teaching them? What are they
Mhm.
learning about what it is to be human while they're on the playground, while they're in the changing room, while they're in the toilets? And what do we need to do in our pastoral curriculum to address and rebalance, and maybe undo some of that stuff? So that's what I mean by that. Really,
Mhm.
it's about asking the questions of what is it that we want our kids to know, and also developing um, a sense of kind of linear progression through that as well. So often, what I've seen in schools is people who are meaning well, but but send out really confusing messages in their. I've got a particular thing about assemblies,
Mhm.
and I think I'll give a couple of examples of this in the book. One school I worked at where the head teacher um, would give every week would have an assembly with the year 11 students, and every time he saw them in an assembly, and in fact I think they had 2 assemblies a week, he would say, we're expecting 70% of you to get 5 A to C grades at your GCSE. That
Mhm.
was the message that they got all the time. And I used to think, what about the 30% of kids who aren't expected to get
Mhm.
that? And they know who they are. What
Mhm.
message are we sending about them to them? What are they hearing from us about their position, their status, their role within that school community? And so that was one that I felt was a particularly damaging message. Another one was a different school. I was a year 10 form tutor, and the head of year gave an assembly. Again, completely well-meaning, this one, where they showed a video on YouTube, which was a montage of clips of people doing amazing things, apparently. So you had somebody who was doing stunts on a BMX and doing great jumps over a ravine or something like that, and you had people doing parkour and those sorts of things. But one of the clips embedded in this montage was somebody who was sort of stepping onto the front of and then jumping over a moving car.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought, we're showing this to year 10, we're showing this to 14, 15-year-olds as an example of aspiration to go jumping over moving cars. And I just thought, what is this about? What are the key messages that the kids are actually going to take away from this? And it's about needing to have a very deliberate curriculum for things like assemblies. And how does today's assembly link with the assembly that we gave them last week? And how will it link to the assembly that we're going to be giving them next week? I was particularly interested in, I remember seeing Claire Seeley talk about curriculum as box set. And this whole thing about, and she talked about how she compared The Simpsons to, I think it was Game of Thrones, where The Simpsons is episodic, right? And that program is, I don't know, what is it, 20, 30 years old now? And every episode, Bart is the same age. There's no kind of progression there. Whereas you watch something like Game of Thrones, and obviously there's an arc running through that of story. And she talks about how dramas the episode will start with previously on Game of Thrones, and then the end might have something like next time on Game of Thrones. And actually, that's a really useful framework for thinking about curriculum generally, and pastoral curriculum in particular, about, okay, what knowledge have we given them before? What knowledge have they already got? And how am I building on that knowledge? And what's the direction that we're going in with this accumulation of knowledge that we're giving them? That was quite a long answer. I hope it's come somewhere near actually answering the questions you asked.
No, it does. It does. There's lots there to pick out, isn't it? Exams. You talked about how one head had said, 70% of you must be getting an exam. So that is one of the questions I had. That you are an English teacher, and you teach, GCSE A-level students. And your job as an English teacher is to get them through the exams so that they leave school with that a good English qualification in the bag. And you are a pastoral lead. Is there a tension between these two roles?
Sometimes I think there is, but it's interesting that, I mean, the way that you phrased that question, my job is to get them through the exams. Well, that's part of my job. Part of my job, actually, I think, as an English teacher, is to give them an opportunity to encounter, the great conversations of humankind.
Yes.
So when I'm doing the poetry anthology, which we do for GCSE English Literature, I'm not just churning through these poems saying you've got to learn this quote, learn that quote, and learn that quote. I'm having conversations with them about why Blake was so angry. I'm having conversations with them about what Romanticism was all about and how that still influences the way that we think about things today. When we read Dulce Decorum Est, it's not just about, in an exam, you need to say this about this poem. It's actually looking at that as a piece of art, as a piece of literature grounded in a particular moment in time. So the examination aspect of it, of course, is very important, but to me, it's kind of one aspect of what we're doing. And what I try to encourage my students to see is that exams are an opportunity for them to show off. They're an opportunity for them to show off what they've learned, what they know, what they're interested in, what they care about in terms of in relation to my subject. And people are talking about, there's no creativity. Schools have killed creativity. Well, I look at the opportunities that my students have to write about literature, to write creatively in their English language papers. And actually, I think that, there's a lot of creativity embedded in that.
Yeah.
So for me, I take that approach. Yes, exams are important, and I inevitably do have to teach exam technique, but I'm much more interested in talking about the literature as literature, and thinking about what it is that the writers are actually doing. If they are then able to write some interesting stuff about it in an exam, then that's a bonus for me, really. So the tension between subject stuff and pastoral stuff, I kind of resolve by thinking, I think schools have got it the wrong way around. Often I see discussions where they say, we give children good pastoral support so that they can achieve academically.
Yes.
To me, that's the wrong way around.
Uh-huh.
I try to give children the best academic experience that I can, in order that they feel good about themselves, that they have a sense of self-worth, that it's a positive impact on their well-being, and also in their long-term well-being. Hopefully they'll go on to get a job that they enjoy and have success with, that they enjoy success in their older life, but more than that they're happy, that they're content in their adult life. Well, that is a pastoral concern. So actually, all of the objectives that we have as schools about them getting, doing well in their exams and going on to do either A levels or some other thing, the next stage of their life. That's all about actually trying to make sure that they've got a contentment in their adult life, and that's a pastoral concern. One of the things that I find interesting is when we look at the findings that came out of the Project Follow Through stuff in America during the 70s, which our listeners may or may not know about, but it's the stuff that compared direct instruction, capital D, capital I, with other intervention tools and pedagogies, and they measured these various different strategies in terms of the academic success that they had, but also in terms of their sense of self-esteem, and one other measure which I forget. But what's really interesting is that programs which were specifically designed to boost self-esteem had low impact on academic success, and also low impact on the self-esteem measure. In fact, some of the programs that were specifically designed to positively boost self-esteem had the opposite effect. Whereas programs which were explicitly academic not only had positive impact on the academic measures, but they also had a positive impact on the self-esteem measures. And direct instruction, of course, had the highest impact on academic outcomes, but also on self-esteem measures as well. And what that suggests, I think, is that when kids do well in school, when they do well in their school subjects, when they are made to feel as though they are succeeding, that inevitably makes them feel a sense of well-being and high self-esteem. So I think really the one of the jobs that we have to do in school is to find ways of enabling kids to experience academic success as often as we can, in order to make them feel that they have a sense of place within the academic field, and that they can achieve academically, and then that gives them an ultimate boost. So to me, the tension is resolved by an acknowledgement that, if I can help my kids to do well in school, then they are going to feel good about themselves.
That reminds me of the time about a couple of years ago. My youngest, she was doing A levels at that time, and she was doing maths. And I was downstairs, and I saw her come down the stairs with a huge smile on her face. And I said, what's up? And she said, oh, I was just doing some maths work, and it was a really, really difficult problem. It took me ages to solve it. but I've done it and I feel so good now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is. I mean, we've all experienced this, and we've also experienced the opposite, haven't we? I mean, there was some subjects at school where I felt hopeless in, and every lesson just confirmed that sense of hopelessness that I had. I look at what my colleagues are doing in specifically maths and things like PE and sport. I'm not a sportsman, and maths I always struggle to get my head around it. But I look at what my colleagues are doing in those subject areas at the school that I work at now, and it's phenomenal. The way that they support and encourage children to succeed and to enjoy success in those fields, the way that my colleagues in the sports department manage to entice and engage kids who are not in any way inclined to sport, generally speaking, and they get involved and they participate, and it's phenomenal to me. And I really wish that I'd had those kinds of teachers when I was at school, because it would have made such a difference to my self-esteem. I had a real kind of negative self-view when it came to maths. I got a, what was it? The first time I did my GCSE maths, I got a grade E, and then I did it again at night school the year after and got an F. So, oh blimey! And it was a couple of years later that I did it again through college. And I'd been working. I'd been, doing stuff with money and things. So I'd got a different attitude towards maths as a result of that, and I got my grade that I needed to get into teaching, and that's almost the grade that I'm still the most proud of.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that I've just completed a doctorate. My GCSE
Yeah.
maths
Right.
is still the grade that I'm perhaps most proud of, because of what it meant to me at that time, what it enabled me to do at that time, and how it made me feel at that time that I'd finally actually succeeded in this subject that for my whole life I'd been beating myself up about. So that whole thing about the link between academic success and self-esteem is so important, and it's so easy to get it wrong. It's so easy to deflate kids' sense of self-worth. And it doesn't actually, I don't think it takes a huge amount of thought or effort to reverse that, to change that narrative. It just needs a bit of thinking about, and that brings me back, I suppose, to the idea of a pastoral curriculum as well, knowledge-rich pastoral curriculum, which is, as a subject teacher, how do I make my subject accessible to students who perhaps don't necessarily find it enjoyable or comfortable, and how do I find ways of making sure that they experience some sense of success with my subject? That's a pastoral concern.
Lovely. That's again, what you've been talking about today. Everything I find, I'm just sat here, listening and in awe to you. It's lovely. I'm going to take another break for the news and ads. But when I come back, as we've been talking about exams, another one for you to ponder as we play the ads is that there have been calls to either abolish or at least completely overhaul.
Oh, I've lost you, Naureen. Oh,
I
hello.
think, yeah, my internet completely went, so I've had to use my phone to tether it.
Oh dear.
And see if that
Need
works.
support with your phonics
Yeah.
teaching? Did you know Oxford University Press
Yes, I
now
can
has
hear everything now.
validated programs to help you? Read Write Ink Phonics, Floppy's Phonics, and the brand new Essential Letters and Sounds. Essential Letters and Sounds will get all your children reading well, quickly, using phonics books you may already know. Developed by the Knowledge Schools Trust English Hub, it's easy to use and make teaching phonics with letters and sounds more effective. Whatever your school's phonics needs, Oxford has the solution. To find out more and receive support from your expert local educational consultant, visit oxfordprimary.com/phonics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond. I'm your host, Yana Lincook, making space for honest conversations about Black, British, Caribbean, and African history. Here to teach you all the things left out of your school books. Make sure you subscribe to the History Hotline on all good podcast platforms. Follow us on social media at the History Hotline on Instagram and at the History HL on Twitter to find out about new upcoming episodes.
Do you struggle with people pleasing? Is it a constant battle managing different and difficult personalities? Why not inspire, challenge, and empower your team through the MAL CPD Essential Coaching Skills for School Leaders course, or gain practical skills to become a strong and compassionate leader through the Assertive Leadership and the Emotionally Intelligent Leader courses. All MAL CPD courses are accredited by the Institute of Leadership and Management. Find out more at www.malcpd.com. Need support with your This is Teachers Talk Radio. This is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. The government has laid out plans to make offering, advertising, or providing essay writing services to university and college students for financial gain illegal. The new measure will be part of the Skills and Post-16 Education Bill, which hopes to transform further and technical education. The Department for Education said it hopes the criminalisation of essay mill services will stop students from falling prey to deceptive marketing techniques from contract cheating services. The latest coronavirus figures show that 204,000 students were absent in England last week due to contracting or having close contact with the virus. This equates to 1 in 40 students off school in England, up from 1 in 80 on September the 7th. Teaching unions have called the statistics grim and fear it is the unvaccinated status of the majority of 10 to 19-year-olds that is causing the rise. That was your latest Teachers Talk Radio News.
Welcome back. I'm Naureen Khalid with Wednesday's The Late Show. And with me, I have Stephen Lane, and we've been talking about pastoral care and exams and so on. So before we went on the break, I asked Steve if what does he think as a pastoral leader about calls to overhaul or completely do away with GCSE and A-level exams. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, this is a funny one, really, and I think, replace them with what would be my question. I get to one of the arguments is that because so many of our students stay on to A level now, that the sort of idea that exams at the end of year 11 mark the kind of end of schooling. Obviously, that's a slightly old-fashioned notion. I mean, certainly when I did my GCSEs back in the 90s, early 90s, no, it was only a small minority of students who would stay on to do sixth form, particularly to do A levels. Other students might go off and do apprenticeships. They might go off to college, and a lot of them just went off and got jobs. So they needed the GCSEs perhaps as a kind of accreditation for that next stage in their life. Whereas now, perhaps that's less needed. But actually, a lot of the calls for reform are to do with anxiety that exams cause for students, and that it's kind of relentless, that they go from one period of examination into another, which I think is probably true, but I think that's not the fault of the exam. I think that's probably more to do with the way that they've become so high stakes for schools, and whatever pressures senior leaders put onto teachers inevitably then get sort of pushed down onto the kids, and exams have become so high status. So I don't know. I think that my question would be what you're going to replace them with. One of the things that upsets me about the GCSE in general principle is that when it was first launched, it was supposed to be an all-encompassing certificate, so that a grade G was a pass, which pretty much meant that any kid could pass the GCSE, and you would just have that sort of level of competence, I guess, marked out by the different grades. And of course, what happened over time was that grade C became the magic grade. We started to think of grade C as being a pass, and then when they reformed them to the numerical system a couple of years ago, that got cemented in actual policy documents, didn't it? That a grade 4 is considered a pass and a grade 5 is considered a good pass. So again, it just means that anything below that, your grade 1, 2, and 3, are utterly meaningless. I don't see the point of having examinations where, I don't know, what's that, a third of the grades available are practically meaningless and useless. I don't get that. I don't understand why we would do that. So I think that there is an argument in favour of overhauling the way that we do it in order to re-establish a sense of the grades having merit, even at the lower end. Maybe there's an argument for some form of I quite like sort of pass, merit, and distinction type approaches to qualifications. I'm the product of BTEC success. You know, my GCSE results were pretty average. My A level results were pretty dire, and I went to college and I did a BTEC national diploma back when they, had some sense of value within the perception of the wider community, and I did really well on that. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that kind of approach. The direct answer to the question though is, I mean, I don't know. The principle of scrapping them or completely reforming GCSE and A levels, I'm open to that as a possibility, depending upon what the alternative is that's suggested. And I've yet to see any really solid suggestions of what an alternative model of examination might look like. One of the things that people talk about, of course, is the idea of module assessment, unitized assessment, a return to coursework, but that is so loaded with problems. As a teacher of English, coursework used to be the bane of my life because the pressure that was placed on teachers by senior leaders to get those coursework marks up, which inevitably became stress that we passed on to the students, and the idea of them of reworking, essentially almost an encouragement to cheat on some of that stuff. I don't want to see a return to those days. But the idea of perhaps having some kind of portfolio of evidence, I'm not opposed to that idea. I think that could work. but I would need to see some actual kind of detailed proposals before I could comment on that.
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm not totally wedded to the idea of these terminal exams, but I've
Mm,
not seen anything which makes me think, yes, that's a better way to do it,
mm.
which,
I mean,
won't add to workload and which will be fair to everybody.
yeah, yeah, and this is it. The workload issue is a big one.
Yeah.
I've often thought that I would quite like to see some kind of, I don't know if this is what they do in the US, but some kind of credit system. So
Hmm.
you would have modules that you would do during your time in high school that amounted to a certain amount of credits. You'd have some compulsory modules, probably in literacy and numeracy, and then you would build up a portfolio of modules that would um, allow you to graduate either at a pass, a merit, or a distinction kind of level, similar, as I guess, in approach to what happens at universities. But I've seen people make reasonable arguments against that on the grounds that what happens at universities isn't exactly foolproof.
Hmm.
That there is inherent issues with grade inflation and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I suppose the biggest problem with what happens at universities is comparability between what one degree at one university might be in terms of a representation of work compared to a degree at another institution. And people will say a degree is a degree,
Mhm.
but I think it is fair to say that degrees in different subjects at different universities probably do carry different weightings in terms of the amount of work that they take. So how do you compare? And another advantage of the GCSE, of course, is that it is a more standard
Mm.
thing across
Yeah.
subjects.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, that's right. Like I said, I'm not wedded to the idea. I wouldn't mind a change, but I need to see proposals in full, and I need to be assured that they are not going to add to workload, that they will be, fair to all students of every background. That's that they won't give an advantage to somebody whose parents can't afford private tutors or take them on expensive holidays to to see the ruins in Rome or whatever.
That's it. And I mean, you've mentioned a really important point there, which is about the fairness.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of compelling arguments that say that terminal exams, are the fairest way to award students for their work. We saw in summer of this year and summer of last year the chaos that ensues when exams are cancelled, and the immense burden of workload that puts on people, and the impossibility, excuse me, the impossibility of being able to actually generate decent comparability there. And we also have a fair bit of evidence that shows that ultimately, because we are human, that human bias, teacher bias, comes
Mm.
into things like
Yeah.
coursework much more than they do in terminal exams. And who is it that loses out through that bias?
Yeah.
It's people from disadvantaged backgrounds that
Yeah.
lose out, and we see that people from disadvantaged backgrounds, the terminal examination is a much fairer system for people from disadvantaged backgrounds than things like coursework. And a lot of the time that we see people arguing in favour of things like coursework are often the very same people who claim to be arguing for social justice.
Mm.
And if you want social justice, then we need to have systems in place that enable children to flourish for what they can do and for what they know, regardless of their name, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their skin colour, regardless of their gender, regardless of their biological sex, regardless of their postcode. And at the moment, the fairest way to do that is through terminal examination, which is anonymised.
Yeah, That's exactly my thoughts on this. Well, hasn't time flown by? We've 90 minutes. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating, and I think this is the longest we've talked to each other. Isn't
I know
it?
we've been Twitter friends for a number of years,
Yeah.
and we've bumped into each other occasionally at Research Ed, but you never really get time to have a proper
No,
conversation of
no,
those things.
yeah.
So it's been an absolute joy and pleasure to speak with you this evening.
Thank you so much for giving up your Wednesday to come to the show. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure we'll continue these conversations on Twitter. And listeners, if you have been, if there are things which you wanted to say, do drop us a line, drop us a tweet at TT Radio 21, and tag Stephen. I'm sure he'll be only too happy to answer.
Of
But
course.
thank you. It's been a pleasure, and good night, everyone.
No, bye bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.